Hello there you lot, time for another video. This time around I'm looking at the Core 2 Duo E8300 for the LGA 775 socket. Launching in April of 2008, the Core 2 Duo E8300 was a dual core processor running at 2.83 GHz and was launched at a price of $163 which is around $192 today, adjusting for inflation, or around £147 or 127 euros. That launch price though was for purchases of at least 1,000 units at a time, so I'm unsure what the actual retail price was. Today though, and despite being out of stock right now at CEX in the UK, it goes for as little as £2 on their website, and for only $1.21 on eBay.com at the time of writing. Just how does it stack up in benchmarks in some relatively modern games today though? Well, hopefully that's what you came here to find out. But before getting on with the test, let's first run through some specs of the E8300. As I mentioned, it ran at 2.83 GHz with a TDP of only 65 watts and had a 1333 MHz frontside bus speed. It featured 410 million transistors built on the 45nm fabrication process, and was based on the Wolfdale architecture with the full 6 MB of L2 cache on offer, 3 MB per core, and also had 64 KB of L1 cache per core as well. Some Pentiums and Core 2 Duos though also use the Wolfdale architecture, but with 3 MB of L2 cache disabled. The rest of the system I'll be using for the test today features a Gigabyte EP45-DS3L motherboard, which has a P45 chipset allowing for better overclocking, 8GB of DDR2 RAM at 800 MHz, a MSI GTX 1080 Armor C Edition graphics card to eliminate any potential bottlenecks other than the processor itself, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and a Phanteks TC14PE to keep the E8300 cool. So let's get on with today's tests. As usual, it's Cinebench R20 to kick things off for today. It's a fairly new benchmark, and its predecessor Cinebench R15 was and still is widely used by various overclockers and other YouTubers. Cinebench R20 renders a photorealistic 3D scene using all of your processor's cores, and produces a score based on the time it took to do so. I'll be running the benchmark a total of 3 times to get a fair average for what the processor can manage. The E8300 at stock runs at 2.83 GHz on all cores, and at that speed it managed scores of 336, 338 and 338 for its free runs respectively. This made for an average score of 337.33. Overclocking wise though, I managed a benchmark stable speed of 3.4 GHz. I was kinda disappointed at this as I had been expecting a lot more, but any higher at reasonable voltages just wouldn't last the benchmark. This was with 1.39 volts set in the BIOS and about 1.344 to 1.36 volts after VDROOP is taken into account. I'll list the rest of the settings in the description below for those that would like to see them. I also managed a slightly higher stable clock in the games of 3.485 GHz, a small increase but an increase nonetheless. That aside, the overclock managed runs of 405, 405 and 407 points respectively for an average of 405.67, 20.26% faster than stock, and also 15.72% slower than the Pentium G2120 I tested a while back, which was running at 3.29 GHz. Lastly, before I get on with the games test, is the physics portion of Firestrike, which I'll also be running 3 times and averaging out the scores to get a fair idea of what it's capable of. It's a benchmark that's also quite common with extreme overclockers and benchmarking enthusiasts alike. The E8300 at stock managed scores of 2414, 2385 and 2435 for an average of 2411.33 points. Using the same overclock from Cinebench though, brought a fairly reasonable increase in scores across the 3 runs, with 2912, 2919 and 2926 points respectively for an average score of 2919, 21.05% faster than before, and also only 7.46% slower than the Pentium G2120 running at 3.29 GHz. First up for the games today is Rise of the Tomb Raider, which I'll be running at 1080p on the lowest settings possible with DirectX 11 mode. I found that the overclock didn't really seem to make much of a difference, as the test still had a number of issues. Both actually seemed to run smoothly at the start of the test, but would stutter pretty badly and dip to as low as 13 frames per second at the worst. Combat in both tests wasn't really affected much, if at all. There was also some noticeable texture popping at the wolf den in the Soviet installation, where the cave interior hadn't rendered yet. When moving the camera, it often appeared stuttery throughout as well, and performance in the copper mill was much the same and was often quite jarring to watch. Both, however, I'd say were actually kind of playable, but only in the sense that you can still do things. The issues don't really have an effect on your abilities to do things in the game. The benchmark at stock showed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 39, 14 and 9 frames per second respectively, and showed multiple spikes in frame times of around 120 milliseconds, with some more reaching up to around 260 milliseconds and one hitting 600 milliseconds at the worst. The overclock showed 40, 15 and 9 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and also had multiple spikes in frame times throughout the test of up to 120 milliseconds, with some as bad as 240 milliseconds at the worst. Next up is CSGO, a game released back in 2012, but one which is still one of the most played games today, and one which has a huge professional scene as well. I'll also be running this with the lowest settings possible at 1080p for both tests, and will be running them in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. Both tests had their issues despite performing reasonably well. Stock clocks managed FPS in the mid-40s to around the 113 frames per second range, depending on your location on the map and the amount of activity on screen, but also had some noticeable but brief micro stuttering occasionally as well. The overclock managed FPS in the high 50s to around the 100 to 110 FPS range, but had noticeable issues with locking up for a brief period of time, which did affect combat at one point for me as well, which you might want to consider, although this only happened at one time from what I remember. Stock clocks though never seemed to show any issues during combat despite this. The benchmark for stock clocks showed an average frame rate of 67 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 34 and 24 frames per second respectively, and also had occasional spikes in frame times of around 120 to 180 milliseconds, with one of 460 milliseconds as well. The overclock though managed 76, 45 and 33 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, a fairly reasonable improvement over stock clocks, with some spikes in frame times reaching 140 milliseconds, and some more of around 40 to 50 milliseconds, showing that stutter overall was reduced compared to stock clocks. With GTA 5, there was a small improvement with the overclock. Throughout the city, stock clocks managed around 24 frames per second up to the low 30s, but had some noticeable micro stuttering as well. The overclock improved slightly here with around 27 up to around 40 frames per second, again with some micro stutter noticed too. There was a point where I noticed a brief lockup at stock, and some minor input locking as well, although this had no effect on playability at all. Both also had a noticeable amount of micro stutter when turning the camera. Out in the desert area, the game at stock clocks appeared stuttery at times, but the overclock managed to reduce this a fair bit, and managed to be playable and enjoyable despite the issues. The benchmark at stock showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 33, 16 and 12 frames per second respectively, with multiple spikes throughout the test of around 85 milliseconds, with more reaching just over 100 milliseconds and a few of around 180 to 200 milliseconds. The overclock showed fairly similar benchmark figures, with 35, 17 and 13 frames per second respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times reaching up to 100 milliseconds, with more of around 120 to 200 milliseconds. Last up for the games in the test today is a favourite of mine, Warframe, which I'll be running at 1080p using the low settings preset in DirectX 11 mode. I'm also running the test in our survival mission on Jupiter. Performance was pretty decent on the Landercraft, with figures in the mid 120s up to the high 190s at stock clocks with no noticeable locking up or stuttering here, the same being true for the overclock but with figures in the low 140s to 200 frames per second range. Both ran smoothly on the planet selection screen, and both were stuttery at points in Miru's Bazaar as well. As you've probably noticed by now, the overclock actually showed worse performance according to the benchmark, but I'm fairly certain that was down to some of the scenes in the overclock test being more intense than its stock clocks. That aside though, both were actually quite enjoyable and definitely were playable. During the mission, stock clocks kept FPS in the low 40s to high 80s range, and there was one occurrence of some noticeable but brief stutter as well. The overclock on the other hand managed to get up to around 105 frames per second, and also showed some very brief but almost unnoticeable stutter, but other than that, neither had any issues at all. There were some spikes in frame times at stock clocks, with some around the 40 to 70 milliseconds mark, and one of around 160 milliseconds. The overclock, as I mentioned, had moments where the on-screen action was more intense, causing the benchmark figures to drop, but it did show reduced stutter throughout the test, with less severe spikes in frame times, with some of around 40 milliseconds and only one of around 60. Overall, I was actually kind of disappointed I wasn't able to get a higher, stable overclock at reasonable voltage levels. That said though, the overclock still showed a performance improvement of around 21%, at least in the benchmarks, as only CSGO and Warframe showed any kind of improvement at all. Most notably CSGO according to the benchmarks, and Warframe definitely showed less stutter with the overclock. If you feel like you learned something today, or enjoyed the video in any way, please consider liking it or leaving a comment on it as well. I'd also really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel or share the video with people that you think might enjoy it. And also, if you would like to consider supporting me in creating these videos, there is absolutely no requirement to do so, but you can do on my Patreon and Ko-fi pages at patreon.com/benching&gaming or ko-fi.com/benching&gaming. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.